Hi everyone, welcome to this edition of Hiring Diaries. Today our guest is Mike McInerney. Mike has had a long and illustrious career in the field of HR. During this time, he's sold companies, taken some public, and has been on the board of Bank of America. Today, he serves as an independent consultant to executive boards of prominent companies. I'll be talking to Mike about the current blend of a recessionary environment, falling stock prices, rising costs, and labor shortage, all at the same time. How should businesses think about their talent strategy in these confusing times? Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Sid. I really appreciate being here today.
Why don't we start with a brief overview of your career?
Okay, sure. When you asked me the question and invited me to participate, it was interesting because I reflected on one of the best interview questions I was ever asked over the course of my career was go back as far as you can remember and tell me what you did and then tell me what you learned from it. And it was to tell me what you learned from it that was the important part. So what I started when I started my career, actually, I took an honors English degree in university. I was going to be a high school teacher of English. Did that for a couple of years and realized that that was not what I was cut out to do. Went back, did a business degree, and really focused. And this was in the mid '70s, so there wasn't a lot of in that world. It was more wasn't talent; it was personnel. It was how do you count people, how do you count head count, all of those kind of metrics, etc. But there was an emerging field at that time, more organizational thinking, and that was what intrigued me. And I had worked for a brewery over the course of a few summers as a university student and had a very intense labor environment. And as a result of that, we had walkouts all the time, et cetera. And we got a new CEO. Went back the next summer and everything was very calm, et cetera, et cetera. And I started to ask questions as to what had gone on. And the first thing that the CEO had done, he came from South Africa. He was a very enlightened guy. And he said, I want you to clear the office next to mine, and I want you to make that office the union president's office. And it was that sheer act of respect and communication. And he said to the union president, anytime you have an issue, come to me first. We'll see if we can resolve it before we get into this contentious. And I thought to myself, as I was going into my MBA program, I thought that's the kind of stuff I want to be interested in, the human dynamics of what is going on out there. So after I finished my MBA, I worked for IBM for a few years. I worked for Xerox for a few years, primarily focusing on the area of compensation, rewards, performance, and that type of thing. I joined Gulf Oil in the early 1980s, just at the end of the oil boom. And as I reflect, Sud, I know you talked about the idea of the economic dynamics. I will tell you that what I feel right now is a lot of the similar kind of sentiments that we felt back in that period of time when we had interest rates that went as high as 20%. Anyway, I'm not predicting that that's going to happen, but the symptoms are all there, and the reactions I'm seeing, at least initially, to that are very similar to the reactions that we had back in the 1980s. But following my career, I joined Gulf Oil, became vice president of human resources there. We ended up selling the company to Chevron, and that was my first experience with mergers, acquisitions, downsizings, and all of those types of things. I left Gulf Oil, joined Hay Consulting for a couple of years, loved consulting, but really didn't enjoy that environment of selling a system. I was more interested in the integration of human dynamics. I went to become vice president after a couple of years there. I went to become vice president of human resources for Nortel, which was a leading edge telecommunications company. Did that for a few years. And then I decided, no, this is the time for me to go into consulting. I had the opportunity of joining a consulting firm, which I eventually bought after a couple of years. We grew it. We sold it to an investment company out of Silicon Valley back in 1998, took it public in 99. We experienced the meltdown of the dot-com crisis. And after that, I left after I sold the company. We went public on NASDAQ. I left after 2 years and went on to become the CEO of a software company called Navantus. Did that for a couple of years, but I was more interested not in managing the technology side, but I really wanted, as the founding CEO, I really wanted to create an organizational foundation that would allow them to grow to whatever extent they wanted to and not make the mistakes that a lot of tech companies do, just reacting to the stimulus, but rather take a longer term view. That company called Navantis just recently sold itself, I think, for about $150 million to a U.S. company. So that foundation, after 15 or 20 years, proved very resilient. After that, I started a coaching company. That would be in the early 2000s, and what we really focused on there was how do we move into this new world where you can provide intimate one-on-one insight as to how people have to behave in these organizations to become effective leaders. So I did that, sold that company to Aon in the financial crisis. You talked to me about what the low points were. Losing 6 clients in 1 week in 2008 was a low point in my career. But we ended up being resilient enough. We sold it to Aon, we took it, and we evolved it into a practice called Rapid Alignment. And what we really focus on now is how do you take an organization and the people at the executive team, middle management team, right down, and align them quickly to new strategies, whether that's post-merger acquisition. So apologize for the long intro, but that's what we do right now. And we work at the business strategy level, we work at the organizational strategy level, and we work at the personnel leadership strategy level.
Mike, even your introduction is like a bit of a story, of course. And I find a new story every time I talk to you, and I spotted a new one even just now. So, looking at the current environment, does this remind you of an earlier time? And how do you remember thinking about talent strategy back then?
That's a really interesting question, because I think I alluded to it a little bit earlier in my introductory comments. But we've been through many cycles, business cycles, growth cycles, recessionary cycles, etc. And I think we're certainly at the end of a growth cycle right now. There are more headwinds than there are tailwinds, and so therefore we're going to be facing a new set of challenges. And I think those challenges are going to be amplified by the pandemic and the return to work and the uncertainty that people have. Are we going back to where we were, or are we moving forward? Where are we right now? So there's that level of uncertainty that is out there. And a lot of the generational managers that we have out there who've been working for 15 years now have seen nothing but blue sky in terms of economic growth and year after year growth. So I think there's going to be challenges both at the corporate level and also at the individual leadership level, with the tendency to want to go backwards, right? I say to my clients today, if you use the word back in any of my conversations, I won't work with you, because I don't want to go back. I want to reflect, and I want to imbue the wisdom and insights of history, but I certainly don't want to go back to where we can't go back. We have to go forward, and we have to anticipate. And so when I look at the current economic churn, the knee-jerk reaction for most companies is to say, what can we do most quickly to impact what we're going to do? And the first thing that they do is they look at their expense line. And they say, okay, well, let's see if we can manage our expense line. And usually when they look at their expense line, somewhere around 50, in some cases, financial institutions can run 60, 70% of their operating expenses people. And so they go, well, if we're going to do anything, we better cut the people. Okay, so now companies have spent the last 6, 7, 8 years talking about how employees are their most important assets, and all of a sudden you move from the balance sheet over to the expense line, Mr. Employee, and now you are a fungible expense. And so what we're seeing now is we're going to see that knee-jerk reaction. That will be, it's just what managers do. It's not what leaders do, but it's what managers do. And when companies are at a point where they're cutting their budgets or they're cutting their people costs or managing their expenses to make budget, you know that we're not in a good space. Okay, so I think the challenge now is, how do HR leaders try to keep that pressure on, saying, no, these are assets. If I look at Sood, and he's worked for me for 10 years at $50,000 per year, I have $500,000 invested in Sood, as opposed to, oh, Sood's cost me $50,000 a year, let's reduce that expense, right? So you're looking at one as an asset. And I think that is, when I reflect on this whole conversation, Sood, that's probably one of the most important pieces of using the word talent. Okay, we're not using, I said when I started working, we used the word personnel. We didn't even have human resources, right? It was just, and personnel was a term that came out of the Second World War. It was more a militaristic term, right? We were still using those kinds of things, and it's been quickly evolving to think, wait a minute here, the assets of an organization are not only the ideas, the patents or the manufacturing processes or whatever it happens to be, but they really are what catalyzes all of that are people. And so I think the challenge that we're going to have for the human resources function right now is that tension or that abrasion between the need to cut expenses in the short term and at the same time maintain the asset and the asset value of the talent you've got. The additional challenge that I think we have today, when I reflect on it, is back when we first did downsizing. So when I was vice president of human resources for Gulf and got acquired by Chevron, I had to take 3,000 people out of the organization. And so that was that was back in the early 1980s. And companies, every time the economy turns bad, the first thing they do is they downsize. Today's talent is basically saying, no, I am not going to be beholden to that kind of knee-jerk reaction. So there's a cynicism that goes along with the talent perspective around how the corporation is going to deal with this. And that, I think, is going to be an additional challenge. That's why you have the emergence of this concept of agency. Hey, I'm my own boss. If you reflect on my career suit, this was in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. Okay, I moved around a lot. Most people of my graduating class worked for 2 or 3 companies over the course of their entire 40-year career. I've consulted with hundreds of companies. I've worked for many, many organizations. So I was an aberration. But if you look today at a resume and you say, well, that person's only worked for one corporation, that's a liability. That's not an asset anymore, right? You say, why didn't that person challenge themselves more? Why don't they have diverse experience? So anyway, so I think that, going full circle back, the challenges, the economic challenges are going to be formidable. There's going to be huge pressure on compensation. And we've lived for the last, I'd say 10 years with, 1%, 2%, 3% budgets. All of a sudden you're looking at 8%, 10% budgets. When I first joined Gulf Oil in 1980, we had a general increase. If you could fog a mirror, literally could breathe, you got on December 31st, you got a 13.5% increase to your salary. And then you got merit on top of that, promotion on top of that. I'm not suggesting we're going back to that, but we are going to have a lot more pressure on that expense line. So that's the tension I think that we're going to be. So how do HR leaders think about that, and how do they push against that continuous pressure to reduce costs and rather talk about and put verbiage around that?
In your opinion, is there a scientific way to approach the problem of reducing cost while treating human resource as assets? And can technology play a role in the process?
Yeah. Well, I do agree that, technology does provide us with a real opportunity to reduce expenses. But again, my challenge is always when I come into an organization, the expense management side of the world is formulaic, right? There are best practices. You can look back and say, oh, okay, here's the best way to do that. Well, we can put a technology platform in there to replace those people or to make that more efficient, more cost effective. And those things are sort of a known universe. The unknown universe, in my mind, is value. And what is the value? Because I can, as I said, I can look at you as an expense for 10 years at $500,000, or I can look at you as an asset. And if I'm going to look at you as an asset, I'm going to say, well, what value over that 10-year period has Sud provided to my organization? And that may be value that is measurable, but but again, we need to develop a new language to describe the organization of the future. We really do. We have to start using terminology that is not sort of historical. So my pushback on your question around expenses, yes, pay attention to expense, use the most efficient ways to do it, but don't become totally preoccupied. Always look at the expense value and work hard at trying to understand how value is created. So if I look at you, not you personally, Sue, but if I look at the example of using you as an asset, and I could say to you, well, what has Sue added to our organization? Well, Sue has been a leader in this area. Sue has provided us with these kinds of ideas or these kinds of innovations, or Sue has been a real community leader in our not-for-profit sector, whatever. Those are things that add value to an organization that are not measured on the income statement, right? But again, you as an individual, as a human asset, can add so much more. I'm going to give you an example. So you mentioned in the intro that I spent 15 years on the board of directors of Bank of America, which was MBNA Bank. And that was one of the high points of my career, to be honest with you, because that organization really understood the value of talent. And in every doorway in an MBNA facility around the world, above every doorway, it said, think of yourself as a customer. Okay. So it implored people to, as you entered that room, don't think about yourself as Sue. Don't think about yourself as your functional job or whatever. Think of yourself as a customer, and then think about how you apply that. That was number one. And one day we were at a board meeting, and I was talking to the CEO who had come in from Delaware, and I said to him, "So what brings you to town, Rick?" And he says, "Oh, I've come in to present the Masterpiece Award." And I said, "Well, what's the Masterpiece Award?" He said, "Well, a Masterpiece Award is for the best idea that anybody's come up with in MBNA Canada this year." I said, "Well, that's interesting." I said, how much is the award?" He says, $5,000. I said, "For the best idea, $5,000? That sounds pretty small." He says, "Yeah, but," he says, it's not the money that's involved." And I said, "Well," he said, "we get so many people participating in this program." And I said, "Well, tell me why that happens." And he described a process. He says, "Michael, every Tuesday at 4:00 in every MBNA facility, all managers get together and they talk about the ideas that people have submitted that week. And in that 1-hour meeting, they will give feedback to that person to say, that is a good idea. We'd like you to help implement that. That's an idea that requires more work. Please come back to us with some more suggestions." Or, this is not a good idea at this point in time, and here's the rationale. In that 1-hour meeting, so you as the suggester or the innovator will get feedback within 1 week in an interaction. He says, that's why we get as much interaction, because people who have ideas in their role, etc. So if you want to talk about best practices of how do you involve your organization, how do you involve your talent, those are the kinds of practices that you have to think about. Those aren't things that are going to hit you in the way. They're sort of secondary and tertiary level thinking about how do you put processes together to involve your talent, to extract the value of your talent. So when we would sit in call centers, like as a board member, they would sit you down in a call center, and I would be sitting in an individual's cubicle, and they'd have 10 Xerox copies of a trophy. And I said, "What's those?" "Well, those are the 10 ideas that I came up with." They were visibly wearing that in their cubicle. Right? So if you walk by that guy, you go, "Whoa, that guy's a real creative person." That's value. Okay. So again, what I'm trying to talk about here is the difference between expense and value, and how do we create on the talent side that new equation that says, here's how we see you as your own agent, and how you can bring value to our organization, not just to perform a job.
You mentioned about technology briefly earlier. Is there a way in which you've seen how organizations have used technology in the past and you wish they were using today? Is there an evolution in how it's used across organizations?
I have seen a great evolution in technology. When I started with IBM in 1975, we had computers that were the size of rooms, And so today, you ask a question of your watch, and it'll give you every piece of information you have. So yeah, a great evolution. That being said, I would say technology. I can look at technology in terms of the technologies that have been designed to support human resources. And those technologies have been really, really interesting. And again, one of the things that intrigues me, Sud, is that companies. And again, this is a bit of a distraction or diversion from your original question, but because technology has been used in human resources for as long as it has, and we go back to HRIS systems that evolved back in the 1970s and 1980s, right? So we've got data that goes back in organizations around how talent has evolved. It goes back years and years. We may not have technology that can actually read Fortran records, but we go back a long way. What we have never done is we have never utilized the data in the way that we can utilize it. So let's park that for a moment in terms of not the technology itself, but the output of the technology, which is the data and the story that the data tells you about your organization. But in terms of technology in HR has been for two reasons. Number one, HRS really evolved because of compliance issues, right? Because you had payroll issues, there were, when you had taxation issues, it's every company's or every country's got different scenarios. So you need a system that can take care of all of that. At the same time, I need to know when you were born, how many kids you've got for insurance purposes, etc. So I've got this body of knowledge about Sood, as you know, or anybody that gives me a picture of that individual. So what we've done now with technologies is we've developed large platforms that, we went to PeopleSoft, then we went to Workday, and there will be Work 2.0 or 3.0 at some point in the future, et cetera, et cetera. So those technologies have been there. The spot technologies, the technologies that support hiring, technologies that support compensation, the technologies that support development, et cetera. Those have been very well developed, and I know those platforms such as Workday try to integrate those things into one common platform. But there's been a great number of efficiency. I think I talked to John Kestenbaum, he's the Talent Tech Labs founder, and he told me that last year there were 800 plus new HR talent technologies that he reviewed, right? So it's burgeoning. Again, most of those technologies are spot technologies to help a particular process become more efficient. The challenge around technology is the utilization. Okay, it's not the technology itself. It's how do you support those people, and how do you support them at least through the initial phases of utilization, interpretation of the data, et cetera. And those are the organizations that worry not only about the technology itself, but rather how is that technology utilized? Is it having the desired impact, the follow-up, the customer? Again, thinking of yourself as a customer from a technology company point of view, how do I do that? So I've seen the companies that I've seen do well are the ones that support that ask the right questions going in, that can customize or meld their approach in a way that is more malleable or more customizable to that particular situation. Because hiring somebody, customer service is different than technology, is different than marketing and finance, et cetera. So we have that. So there's that aspect of technology that I think has really, those spot solutions are out there. I think what's going to happen now is you're going to see, because there's so many startups, you're going to see a lot of consolidation. And I know that there are a number of companies out there, investment companies, that are looking to sort of say, okay, where are the companies that sort of fit together, and how can we create a larger, more functional set of technologies?
Now, maybe just for a final question, do you have any advice for our viewers, especially people in the HR space who are entering it now or have been in the space for a much shorter period of time and want to develop their career? I think the way you have thought about selecting your career moves will help people think about how to grow their own career.
I think my best advice to anybody entering the HR function, and again, HR is susceptible to people wanting to work within a very narrow set of confines. Okay, so if you work in compensation, you work in compensation. If you work in development, you work in training development. You work in recruiting, you work in that. So HR has actually been quite siloed. And I'll go back to your first question, or an earlier question that you asked about, the HR leader of the future, et cetera. The HR leader of the future has to think about those pieces in an integrated way. Because when I talk to somebody about coming into the organization, I need to look at that person not only in terms of their skills and their capability, but also from the point of view of fit. I've got to look at character. I've got to look at behavior, because the skills only get you in the door, right? It's the behavior that makes you more effective. It's how you fit into the team, how you lead, all of the values that you carry. So if I were an HR person, I would not. I would try to work across functions, or even if I was looking in compensation, I would not talking about compensation as to where do we sit in terms of the marketplace, or whatever, or the number of job evaluation points that we get. Okay, but rather, how does the value proposition that we provide work with the hiring function to provide a compelling value proposition that goes beyond just the dollars and cents, but also talks about the work experience, the collaboration, the cultural environment, etc. So what I would challenge HR people to do is think about all of the aspects that go into an organizational strategy. Just like you have a business strategy that says, this is what we need to be, this is what we want to be differentiated in the market, here's how we want to run our business, here are the financial criteria we need to apply. Just as you have that as your strategy, you need an organizational strategy to support and drive that. And that organizational strategy is, how do we put ourselves together functionally as an organization? How do we encourage collaboration and innovation? Those types of things. So you are, as an HR person, you are a facilitator of this to the rest of the organization, as opposed to being, come to us and we'll tell you whether we're going to give you the number of job points that you need, or we're going to give you that promotion. Okay. So my advice to people is reach out and try to get involved with the line management. I'm going to give you one last story. So this is back again. I had just started first day on the job, and I'm director of compensation for Gulf Oil, and we're doing oil exploration in the Beaufort Sea in the Arctic. And I get a call from the captain of the drilling ship, and he says he wants to give this one particular person a salary increase, a 15% increase. And I'm thinking, oh my God, 15%, that's an awful lot of money. And I come from IBM and Xerox, which are very sort of cost-conscious companies. And so I started to say to this guy, I said, well, is there some way we can sort of give him less? And he stops me 10 seconds into and he says, Mike, he says, we spill more over the sides of the barrel in 1 minute that it's going to cost Gulf to give them the increase. Give them the effing increase. And at that moment in time, I thought, you know what? I got to think of myself as the drilling ship guy, as opposed to thinking about the compensation control guy. So as an example of how to think about yourself as an HR leader, think about yourself as a line manager. Don't think of yourself as an HR expert.
I think that's a very useful perspective, and it's going to be very useful for our viewers. Mike, thank you so much for spending time with us. It's been fantastic talking to you.